Hi, this is Masterful Living, new vocabulary for the holy life. And I'm really glad that you take time to join me in these conversations, in learning together about the nature of God's call to holiness. Remember, it's not a high-latch theological theme. It is accessible to all of us. Last session, we talked a little bit about the transformation of our character. The first descriptor, remember descriptor, it's not prescription, it's a description. The first descriptor that I shared with you about walking the holy life, that God's nature of otherness begins to transform us. Now, if that's the only thing that we focus on when we pursue holiness, is the otherness of God, the difference, being set apart from the human nature that's all around us, the tendency is very easy for humans to become isolated and sectarian. Matter of fact, many of you have probably experienced that in one form or another, a legalism, an imposition of behavior saying, if you really want to be a disciple of Jesus, then you have to behave in this certain way. And if you don't behave in this certain way, then you're really not a blue chip kind of valid, authentic disciple of Jesus. As if somehow there are standards and that we must achieve in our own strength. So if we only talk about a transformed character, then it will easily lead to a legalistic imposition or sectarianism, this holy bubble or this isolated, exclusive club that is so heavenly minded we're no earthly good. And we know that that really doesn't have a good effect. And we know that that is something that many people have really, really resisted. And there have been traditions that have tried to force us into behaving in a certain way in order to achieve that. And I want to assure you that holiness is not fitting into a certain list of behaviors. But if we only focus on a transformed character and we see that as the principal and only descriptor of the holy life, the net result is we will become this little bubble of isolated hyper-spirituality that is exclusive, and we then become a fortress that imposes those restrictions on others, and Paul calls that legalism. And we've been set free from that legalism. So the second descriptor that I want to talk to you about is sort of like the antidote to that. It doesn't eliminate it, but it builds on it. That second descriptor of pursuing the holy life is what I call responsible engagement. Responsible engagement really is built on the premise, the scriptural theme, or some of you may call it a theological principle, of the incarnation of God. You see, and when I say responsible, I don't mean that it's simply mature and we're acting responsibly and all of that. What I mean is that we take responsibility to initiate engagement. Think about how God engaged us. We were very different, we were very fallen, we were very estranged, separated. Proximity was broken between us and God because of our willful selfishness. And God did not leave it at that. God chose to take initiative. God chose to take responsibility. God took the responsibility to initiate engagement with us. He didn't wait around for us to come begging, for us to come back and us to come to him saying, God, please let us back in the garden. No. God took initiative and said, I love you so much that I'm going to step out, take initiative. I'm going to take the responsibility for healing this rift that exists between us. And so he sent the prophets, the priests, the kings, the judges, and he sent the law even as a means to do that. And Hebrews says in these last days, he sent us his son, Jesus Christ, you see. The incarnation of God in human flesh. That epitomizes responsible engagement. God taking responsibility to initiate engagement with a fallen condition, a fallen humanity. He didn't wait for us to be asking. He didn't wait for us to come knocking at the door. He took responsibility and he initiated engagement. Well, in same fashion, for those who are pursuing the holiness of God, and for those who are beginning to reflect the holiness of God in you, the greater measure of God permeating your life, you're going to find that you increasingly are going to become responsibly engaged with the people around you. You're not going to wait for them to come and say, hey, how do I know God? How do I discover God? Hey, how do I come to church? How do I begin to discover the fullness of Christian faith? They're probably not going to do that. And we don't wait around for that. People who pursue the holiness of God in them by God permeating them are going to see the needs all around. And we're going to take initiative. We're going to take responsibility to initiate engagement with the others, with the culture, with the people around us, even though it may create a little bit of messes for us, even though it may be a little difficult, and at times we will be criticized for that kind of engagement. I'll be doing another series on the whole idea of a case for engaging the world around us. We will be criticized for engagement. And we might actually get a little dirty when we engage the people and the conditions and the culture around us. But it is incumbent upon the one who is saturated with a holy God to naturally allow that holiness to flow out of us in initiative, engagement, to take responsibility for the people around us, whether they like it or not, whether they know it or not. We feel responsible to reach, to engage, to bring God's holiness, to bring God's transforming holiness into that environment. Responsible engagement, then, is this antidote to the sectarian isolation that comes with a singular emphasis on a transformed character. When we just talk about transforming our character, being holy inside, but not doing anything outside, responsible engagement comes along and says, no, if the holiness of God is truly a part of who you are and it's really leaking out of your pores, then you are going to reach. You are going to take responsibility. You're going to feel compelled to reach into cultures of people who don't look like you, act like you, think like you, behave like you, into the systems of the world to make a difference. That's the kind of impulse that begins to come for those who are pursuing the holiness of God. Now, the scriptural reference for that, of course, would come out of the Gospels where Jesus tells us to go. Go and engage. Go and make disciples. Go and love your neighbor as yourself. You know, it's shot throughout Scripture where Jesus compels us. Now, just as there is an extreme and a potential pitfall if we emphasize one of these descriptions too much, like I said with transformed character, if that's the only way we define holiness, it can become a legalistic exclusive bubble. Similarly, if the only thing we use to assess or to describe holiness is engagement with the culture around us, then that can easily lead to simply social activism, you see, without a substantive heart-nature transformation. If all we're doing is reaching into the cultures of the world, if all we're doing is reaching into our community, feeding the poor, clothing the naked, helping the distressed, if that's all we're doing, and there's no substantive otherness, there's no transformation of character to go along with that, if that's all we're doing, then we're just doing social activism. And frankly, you know, there are other groups that are really good at that, like the Lions Club, the Rotary Club, the Kiwanis Club. They do that really well. And many of the charitable organizations do that. Holiness is much more than simply social activism. Holiness is more than simply responsible engagement. It is responsible engagement compelled by the desire that the character be transformed in the likeness of God. So you see, these two things go very closely together. And as you see, as we proceed through this series, you're going to see them all woven together as a group of descriptors that proceed out of the heart of God, who is holy and who calls us to be holy through the journey of masterful living.